Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is science fiction writer William Gibson. While Gibson himself does not believe that science fiction's primary concern is the prediction of the future, he nevertheless is responsible for coining the term cyberspace and for envisioning the world of the internet and the World Wide Web long before it became a reality. Gibson's debut novel, Neuromancer, was the first to win the science fiction Triple Crown, the Hugo Award, the Nebula, and the Philip K. Dick Memorial Award, at a time that many of the technologies we now take for granted were hard to fathom, and yet Gibson led us to try. Gibson more recently has been writing novels in the half-reality of the present day and near past. The Chicago Tribune says of his book, Pattern Recognition, that no novel has yet to surpass it as a meditation on the attacks of 9/11. His work is central to both the cyberpunk and steampunk movements, and The Guardian in 1999 said Gibson was the most important novelist of the past 2 decades in terms of influence. He's here today on Between the Covers to talk about his much-anticipated new novel, The Peripheral, one that returns Gibson's imagination to that of the future, both near and far. Welcome to Between the Covers, William Gibson.
Well, thank you.
Why don't we start with the kernel, the original impulse or thought that began the project of The Peripheral for you?
Oh, that's difficult because it starts with a cluster of kernels, really, and the process begins before the idea. And the process begins, and I wait for the idea to sort itself out of whatever I've accumulated since the last time.
Well, let me rephrase and ask you, was there something in your life where you were in relationship to your past works that led you to choose to place a work again in the near and far future versus the recent past?
That's easier. That's easier to address. I had initially I wrote 3 novels set in what I assumed was the mid 21st century. I wrote them in the mid to late 80s. I then wrote 3 novels set approximately now, and that was in the 90s, and those books, which began with Virtual Light, I think of now as really they're not about a future as much as alternate history, because we've lived our way into their time. And when I got to the end of that second set, I had a feeling that the yardstick of weirdness, as I think of it, that I used to measure the bandwidth of weirdness in contemporary reality had become outdated. And it was a very essential navigation tool, had been for me, a really essential navigation tool for creating imaginary futures, because in order to work, they have to be a little bit weirder than contemporary reality. And I was writing a book called All Tomorrow's Parties, which closes that 3-book sequence. And I kept, in effect, looking out the window, and the world outside the window was at least fully as weird as the world I was describing in the book. And I thought that my yardstick was out of date. So I began a project with pattern recognition to recalibrate my yardstick of contemporary weirdness. Basically, I was exploring the real world in a way that I hadn't done before. And having completed that project, it seemed to me that it behooved me to attempt an imaginary future again, just to see whether I'd been right and whether the yardstick worked. And so that was the reason I tried to do this. And what happened was that once I had the machine, if you will, that does the imaginary futures up and running again, and it was very dusty and rusty and had not been used literally in the real 21st century until I wrote this book. I started shoveling in everything, all the weirdness that had accumulated in the past 14 years of the 21st century, and the stuff that started slowly coming out the other side was so dire for the most part that I was kind of appalled. That I thought, this doesn't look good. This is darker. This is darker than Neuromancer. This stuff would give the characters in Neuromancer heart attacks. So some of it, like they wouldn't want to go to this world. So I thought, well, that's what it is. And so I started my process of casting, the casting call, like who will the characters be? And I don't even know how I do that, but it's something I have to do at the beginning of the book. And I got this young woman walking down a hillside somewhere in the rural United States toward running water in the evening. I don't know why. And I kept working with that, and she began to emerge, and as she began to emerge, her milieu emerged with her. And so I began to have half of it, and then eventually, through a similar but separate process, I wound up with the other half of it, which is the counter viewpoint to her viewpoint, and they alternate in the chapters.
You have two futures. One you just mentioned, sort of a near future rural American South, which is an unusual setting, I think, for a lot of science fiction, and then one that's several generations ahead of that in London that's radically different. Can you talk about what was appealing about those two locations and the difference in differential in time frames?
Well, initially I didn't have the idea of the differential in time frames. I assumed that Flynne's world in her quite economically unfortunate county, in whatever state it is, it's deliberately kept vague as to what state it might be, and all of the town names in that state that you do see are completely imaginary. I thought that there would be some bigger, more sophisticated outside influence that would be in contrast to her, and I thought it could be something as simple as the people from Atlanta are really bad news compared to the people in her hometown. It could just be like bigger drug dealers or something, but that wasn't emerging for me, and there were no characters turning up. And then I happened to go to London, and I had lunch and a visit with my friend Nick Harkaway, the novelist. And he happened, for some reason, standing in his back garden in Hampstead, to explain to me the electoral politics of the City of London, and how the City of London is in a strange way, an entirely separate country and not entirely a democratic one. Really, really bizarre. And to this day, because I haven't seen him since, and I sort of haven't dared to ask him, I'm not sure whether he told me the truth or made it up. But either way, it triggered this sort of fugue state of imagination in which I imagined what he was telling me as the government of a really successful post-apocalyptic London. And by the time I got home again to Vancouver, that had gelled into Wilf and his various problems, and the shadowy and necessarily the creepy and necessarily kind of shadowy government that runs his world.
Well, tell our listeners what a peripheral is in the book.
Well, a peripheral is an artificial but largely biological human body. And peripherals in our world in terms of computing would be your mouse or your keyboard or an extra screen for your computer. It's anything that adds functionality to a computer. In Wilf's world, peripherals are genetically human, but not, in other ways, essentially non-human extra bodies that people can inhabit and operate and experience the sensoria of from any distance. So if you live in Portland and you can afford to keep a peripheral in Paris, whenever you want to be in Paris, you just jack in and you're in Paris in your other body, doing anything that you could do in your own body, except apparently have a sense of smell.
Huh.
I don't know why, but that came in, unless you're willing to pay a lot extra for the thing to have, for your peripheral body to have a sense of smell. I think the idea emerged from wondering idly what the absolute end point of drone technology would be. And I think it would be a drone body. And when the peripherals in the book, the peripheral bodies in the book, aren't being used, they're controlled by their manufacturer's cloud AI, which just makes them behave like courteous, quiet human beings. And you wouldn't realize initially that, you probably would never realize that what you're talking to is an artificial body controlled by this company's cloud AI, because it's very pleasant and it can carry on a conversation, but there's nobody there. It has no self. And if the cloud AI is turned off, it just sits. And people sometimes leave them under dust covers.
Our protagonist in the near future, rural South, Flynne, the drama starts in the peripheral when she takes over for her brother, who thinks he's beta testing, being hired to beta test a game. And she sits in and in playing this game witnesses what may be a murder, which she is led to believe could be a real murder, and that this may not be a game at all. And that tension that happens there when you mentioned drones, it reminds me a little bit about that dissonance around ethical responsibility the video game quality
Yeah.
of drones. And in this case, the potential assassination may not even be happening from a government. Like today, we think of it mainly from governments, but in the future, it may be quite a private individual using a drone.
And Flynne's brother and his posse of young veterans are all like mad for drones, and they have dozens of them because they worked with them in the war, and they have them the way somebody that they might have a shotgun.
Huh. I don't know if you've been following Gamergate recently, the controversy around women in the gaming world who've spoken up about sexism and have been threatened with violence. But there was a certain satisfaction in light of Gamergate to have a female protagonist in the game world, and it almost felt like a feminist critique of some of the violence that one sees in gaming. And I wondered if that was a conscious thing, or if perhaps I'm reading it, bringing that into it.
It very much predated. Like the book was turned in its final form in mid-July, and at that point I knew nothing. I knew nothing of Gamergate, but I have a daughter in her early 30s who's a native gamer. She grew up with the games, and what I really know of games is through her, and watching her play them. So I'm extrapolating in this book. I'm extrapolating from that parenting experience, and just from what I've been able to. She also sometimes professionally works in the games industry and in game development, so I have a little bit of contact. A little bit of contact with that. The idea that I found that most interested me in the Peripheral is that Flynne plays the very violent games that she played when she still played games for a living, and it's one of the ways that in this book that a disenfranchised American underclass can put dinner on the table. They work for richer gamers who assemble armies of really good, skilled players and bet large sums of money on the outcome. But the people who are fighting and dying in the games are doing it to feed their children, and that resonated for me as a let's not go there sort of thing. I could see, it's one of those things that I could sort of see happening. I hope it doesn't come to that.
Well, I'm surprised that I see some reviewers saying the Peripheral is optimistic. I think there's hope in you. There's a space of hope, and I think it's cautionary, but it doesn't feel like this sort of late stage capitalist collapse is really necessarily an optimistic vision.
I think that the end of the book, I wasn't planning it this way, but having finished it, and I was sitting around with it, trying to figure out what it was I had done. It seemed to me that the end of the book is a sort of litmus paper for the reader's socio-political sophistication. And if you want to think that's a happy ending or an optimistic ending, well, more power to you. but I found it gratifyingly ambivalent when it finally, as the author, I was like really relieved at the, it seemed to me, genuinely creepy level of ambiguity, which is pretty clearly underlined. I mean, one of the book's major characters, very major characters, and the character in the book who knows the most about what's really happening in the world, her last lines in the book are human, all too human. And that was quite conscious on my part.
Well, I know that you push back against people who consider a lot of your work dystopian, saying that you could certainly imagine worse worlds than the ones that you paint. But at the same time, it would be a stretch, I think, as you said, to call them optimistic or bright futures.
Well, I thought when I began to write, when I was writing, I didn't really think about this until I began to write my first novel. I don't think I thought about it when I was doing my journeyman short stories. But when I began to write Neuromancer, I had to make a lot of decisions very quickly. The book was actually commissioned, which is weird. Otherwise, I don't think I would have ever tried to write a novel at that point. One of the things I decided was that I didn't have it in me to do space opera. Like, I didn't feel it. I didn't want to do post-apocalyptic wasteland, which is sort of the traditional thing for a young man to do because a young man doesn't know much about anything, and he can always do an apocalyptic wasteland. And the world, at that time in the world, the Cold War was still going on in the United States and the USSR, were poised every passing second with their fingers on the button that could destroy the entire world forever. It actually sounds insane now to say that, but that was literally the case. And we now know, in retrospect, historically, that on at least 2 occasions, very specific dates, which weirdly we neither know nor celebrate. You can look the dates up. It nearly happened. It came, some Russian at a keyboard stopped it, saw that the systems were automated, and shut that down. The Americans aren't really launching a preemptive strike. Anyway, it seemed to me that when I wrote Neuromancer, that it was an act of optimism because so many intelligent, well-informed adults around me at that time thought that our fate was going to be mutually assured destruction. And in Neuromancer, that hasn't happened. They had a little abortive nuclear war, and the global multinationals said, yeah, you're not doing that again. And they did whatever it is they did that created that world. So it did seem optimistic to me then, and even today, a huge number of the world's population would happily immigrate to the world of Neuromancer and be way better off. Mm-hmm. I'd rather live in Neuromancer than Mogadishu. It's got more potential.
Right.
I mean, it's actually safer.
Yeah. In case you just tuned in, we're talking to William Gibson about his latest novel, The Peripheral. Well, let's have you read a little bit from the book for our listeners.
Okay, well, I'm going to read the second chapter of The Peripheral, which is called Death Cookie, and is written from the point of view of Wilf Netherton, a dissolute young British publicist somewhere in the future. And He's just awakened with a terrible, he's awakening in this chapter with a terrible hangover. And while he's been blacked out, a problem has developed with his most recent client, who was until very recently his most recent girlfriend, which is going to prove hugely problematic throughout the course of the book. Netherton woke to Rainey's sigil pulsing behind his lids at the rate of a resting heartbeat. He opened his eyes. Knowing better than to move his head, he confirmed that he was in bed alone, both positive under current circumstances. Slowly he lifted his head from the pillow until he could see that his clothes weren't where he'd assumed he would have dropped them. Cleaners, he knew, would have come from their nest beneath the bed to drag them away, flinch them of whatever invisible quanta of sebum, skin flakes, atmospheric particulates, food residue, other. Soiled, he pronounced thickly, having briefly imagined such cleaners for the psyche, and let his head fall back. Rainey's sigil began to strobe demandingly. He sat up cautiously. Standing would be the real test. Yes, he asked. Strobing ceased. Un petit problème, Rainey said. He closed his eyes, but then there was only her sigil. He opened them. She's your problem, Wilf. He winced, the amount of pain this caused startling him. Have you always had this puritanical streak, he asked. I hadn't noticed. You're a publicist, she said. She's a celebrity. That's interspecies. His eyes, a size too large for their sockets, felt gritty. He must be nearing the patch, he said, reflexively attempting to suggest that he was alert, in control, as opposed to disastrously and quite expectedly hungover. They're almost above it now, she said, with your problem. What's she done? He asked. One of her stylists, she said, is also evidently a tattooist. Again, the sigil dominated his private, pain-filled dark. She didn't, he said, opening his eyes. She did? She did, said Rainey. We had an extremely specific verbal on that, she and I, he said. Fix it, she said, now. The world's watching, Wilf. As much of it as we've been able to scrape together anyway. Will Daedra West make peace with the Patchers, they wonder? Should they decide to back our project, they ask? We want yes and yes. They ate the last 2 envoys, he said, hallucinating in sync with a forest of code, convinced their visitors were shamanic spirit beasts. I spent 3 entire days last month having her briefed at the Connaught. 2 anthropologists, 3 neo-primitivist curators. No tattoos. She understood that. No tattoos. A brand new, perfectly blank epidermis. And now this. Talk her out of it, Wilf. He stood experimentally, hobbled naked into the bathroom, urinated as loudly as possible. Out of what exactly? Parafoiling in, she said. But that's been the plan, he began. In nothing but her new tattoos, she said. Seriously? No. Seriously, she said. Their aesthetic, he said, if you haven't noticed, is about benign skin cancers, supernumerary nipples. Conventional tattoos belong firmly among the iconics of the hegemon, It's like wearing your cock ring to meet the Pope and making sure he sees it. Actually, it's worse than that. What are they like? Post-human filth, she said, according to you. No, he said, I mean the tattoos. Something to do with the gyre, she said. It's abstract. Netherton groaned. Cultural appropriation, he said. Lovely. Couldn't be worse. On her face? Her neck? No, Rainey said, fortunately. If you can talk her into the jumpsuit we're printing on the Moby right now, we may still have a project. He looked at the ceiling, imagined it opening, himself ascending into he knew not what. Then there's the matter of our Saudi backing, she said, which is considerable. Visible tattoos would be a stretch there. Nudity's non-negotiable. They might take it as a signal of sexual availability, he said, having done so himself. The Saudis, she asked. The Patchers, he said. They might take it as her offer to be lunch, she said. They're last either way. She's a death cookie, Wilf, for the next week or so. Anyone so much as steals a kiss goes into anaphylactic shock. Something with her thumbnails, too, but we're less clear about that. He wrapped his waist in a thick white towel, considered the carafe of water on the marble countertop. His stomach spasmed. Lorenzo, she said, as an unfamiliar sigil appeared, Wilf Netherton has your feed in London. He almost vomited then at the sudden input, bright saline light above the garbage patch and the sense of forward motion.
You've been listening to William Gibson read from his latest novel, The Peripheral. You often mix noir detective elements with science fiction, and in this case, there is definitely a murder mystery and a sense of that spiraling out through time in two different times. Are there people who've done that prior to you that you credit as influences, that mix? Or if not, are there some particular detective fiction authors that you consider touchstones?
I know I very much had Elmore Leonard in mind writing this book, but mainly for his gift for dialogue and his use of white space on the page and his minimalism. I didn't go back and read him, but I kept his dictums of his writing somewhat in mind because I wanted that for the Flynne thread. The Netherton thread is written in a florid sort of neo-Victorian style that I probably shouldn't associate with Mervyn Peake, but I do. I was thinking of Peake's Gormenghast as a kind of linguistic model for describing that particular kind of seemingly magical weirdness that Wilf is surrounded by. And I don't know. The question of influence as I get older changes, because I know that 20 years ago, if someone asked me who my influences are, who my biggest influences were, I would have had a list right ready, and it would have been William Burroughs in some ways, J.G. Ballard and others, Thomas Pynchon. But really, what I was doing was I was inviting the listener to identify me with those right. Artists. And as I've gotten older, I've come to realize that my real influences I was probably scarcely aware of. I think that Lynn Dayton's earliest spy novels, which I remember just absolutely loving as a teenager, are probably a big influence. I was just never conscious of it. I mean, I really think our real influences come from our native literary culture, which we acquire very young if we're going to be generally acquire very young if we're going to be serious readers. So I think all of that was already in place when I started to try to write fiction in my mid to kind of early late 20s, and so there weren't adult epiphanies reading someone when I was 25 and thinking, yes, I'm going to. This guy, he's found the way. I'm going to be like him. I don't think it was like that. I think I was already colored in certain ways without even realizing it. And probably the most powerful influences were secondary education. I don't think it was what I was reading as an undergraduate in university as much as what I was reading when I was 15 or 12.
Well, one of the choices that I really like that creates a specific experience that I think doubles down on this detective aspect of the Peripheral is that you tend to avoid exposition. We are dropped into the worlds. We have to infer what the objects are, what the vocabulary is of the world, and it takes some time. And while we're watching the characters themselves try to piece together the clues around the mystery in the narrative, we are trying to piece together the world and dimensionalize it through watching them move in it rather than through exposition. Is that something that, as you wrote the Peripheral, you specifically were aiming for as an effect, as a reader effect?
It wasn't as though I stood apart from the process of the text and made a creative decision. It was much more organic than that. In fact, what happened was that I was appalled initially by how much work it was to move the narrative forward in the way that I had begun it. So I began to more consciously understand the way that I had begun it, and I began to see that it had seemed to have made certain rules for itself. And I thought that if I violated those rules, I was never going to find out what they would ultimately have produced. And one was that it would be very, very sparse on exposition. It would lack what science fiction writers sometimes call the, as you know, Bob, pages.
Right.
Where someone explains how the universe works. And as a reader of fantastic fiction of various kinds, one of my greatest pleasures of the text is being required to infer the meaning and structure of a world I've been thrown into that initially seems incomprehensible. I just love doing that.
You said in an interview once that the lack of novelty growing up in a small town in rural southern United States made you develop this capacity to infer, that you could look at an object and imagine a distant place because of an absence of stimulation. Could you talk a little bit about that in relationship to this?
Well, when I began to try to write fiction, I found it far more difficult than I had imagined it would be. In fact, I found it impossible. That the only thing that I could do from the start with any surety and pleasure was to describe imaginary objects, or describe real objects in imaginary conditions. And my earliest published fiction is actually a collage of descriptions of imaginary objects. I found a way to frame it with surrealist elegance, as I thought at the time, and I could just bodge all these imaginary things together. And I still, to some extent, work that way. It became like a standard tool in my toolkit that I could give the reader more of what the reader needs to understand the nature of the world, and have the satisfaction, the reader would have the satisfaction of having figured it out for herself. I could do that with manufactured objects, wherein are, to me, visible the whole history of our society. Like walking into a junk shop or a flea market, for me is an experience akin to walking into a really great museum, because it's all human artifacts, and all human history is there in a sense. So I wanted to play by very strict rules of science fiction golf, and not make it easy for the reader to figure out what was going on. On a second reading, though, I can pretty much guarantee a close second reading, the reader of the Peripheral, the reader will realize that huge parts of it are prefigured, and that the meaning, the situation is actually spelled out in quite a number of ways going in. It's just not possible to get it the first time through. Not that the structure of the book is coherent, because I don't even think in terms of structure, but the texture is sort of fractally coherent, maybe like 85% fractally coherent. Like, it makes a kind of sense in and of itself that is more evident on a second reading, and it's filled with sort of Easter eggs for people who've already read it once.
Well, there's also a certain pleasure in having two futures, looking at one future's relationship to its own past, which is in this book the other future, the nearer future.
Yeah.
Wilf Netherton, living in the far future London, doesn't seem enamored at all by the world that he's living in, and has this great fascination and nostalgia for the past, which raises the question, is this something universal throughout human? Is it something universally human? I wonder, because it feels like...
I suspect that it is, because it's something I've noticed in my lifetime as a reader, is that every generation avenged, when every generation is finally old enough, they seek come to see themselves as the last truly human generation before the deluge of whatever that weird stuff is that's coming over the hill to crush them. And you can find that the ancient Greeks did it really, really eloquently, like the ancient Chinese did it. We've always done that, and together with it, there's often a sort of concomitant admiration for the authenticity and realness and simplicity of life in the past. And one influence on this, I think, this book was Deadwood, because the thing I most loved about Deadwood is that it's set in this mythic-looking place that we all grow up seeing in movies and on TV, and inhabited by these people who we, for the most part, traditionally have depicted as being like us, but rubes in some way, like technologically unsophisticated, and people who would like freak out if they were exposed to our level of advanced technological complexity, but innocence, and in Deadwood you see that set, and it's inhabited by the scariest people you've ever seen on television. Bad guys who could take out any bad guy you've ever seen on television just by thinking about it, because they're really, really smart, and they're out to survive. And that fascinated me. I thought that was an incredibly great thing that Deadwood did. And I was also conscious of the way in which in science fiction, traditionally, there's a kind of tradition in science fiction of viewing the inhabitants of the future as effete, somehow, weak, decadent creatures. Their brains are too large. Their limbs are spindly. I mean, that's been a cliche of science fiction almost since science fiction began. And I thought, that's funny. We think it's truly all too human, because we think that the people in the past are hicks and rubes and naive, and that the people in the future are weak and effete. Who's good? Who's the crown of creation then?
Right.
If not us. And that's the human nature part.
And you've said before that you suspect that we're like the Victorians in the sense that our own self-perception is going to potentially be very different than the way history sees us ultimately.
Yes, although I think that it's not so much the Victorians. I think that we're like everybody. I mean, that same idea will apply ultimately to whoever might be looking at us in the future. They have no more. The people in the future will have no more idea of what the people further in the future will see them as than we do.
Well, you've also talked about how you feel like it's easier to imagine the future, to imagine the way the future might be, than it is to actually imagine the past. I think you've even mentioned it would be harder to imagine a world without audio recordings, for instance, than it would be to imagine an extension of the technologies that we have today.
I still think that's true. Anyone can do the thought experiment of trying to imagine what the world was like prior to recorded sound, and it's an odd thing. Or something else I've been thinking about lately is how all of the literature and all of the films and art prior to the advent of the cell phone are going to seem to depict an entirely alien other world of quite incredible human isolation, in which in a 1940s film, an individual alone on the street is actually alone on the street. And that's going to become incomprehensible to us. And I suspect it already is, to some extent, incomprehensible to most of us, because we're we're a Ask Siri away from speaking to anyone we know anywhere in the world at any time, and we live in a sort of quasi post-geographical universe. So the world of actual Victorian novel, like a Dickens novel, is going to require this fantastic imaginative effort on the part of late 21st century readers.
Wow, that's really interesting to think about, actually. In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to William Gibson, the author of The Peripheral. There's a central aspect to The Peripheral that is a spoiler that I'm not going to explicitly say, though we may dance around it a little bit. But one aspect of the book that you do that feels like a very unique part of the book, you've attributed an inspiration to a short story from the 1980s by Bruce Sterling. And yet, I don't know if you read the Tor.com review that suggested the possibility of a connection and or inspiration from Borges. But I know you love Borges.
Yeah.
But there was this great quote, and I'm from the story called "The Garden of Forking Paths" that I was just going to read and see if that felt like a companion piece to The Peripheral.
That'd be interesting.
Your ancestor did not believe in a uniform absolute time. He believed in an infinite series of times, in a growing, dizzying net of divergent, convergent, and parallel times. The network of times which approached one another, forked, broke off, or were unaware of one another for centuries, embraces all possibilities of time. We do not exist in the majority of these times. In some, you exist and not I. In others, I and not you. In others, both of us. In the present one, which a favorable fate has granted me, you have arrived at my house. In another, while crossing the garden, you have found me dead. In still another, I utter these same words, but I am a mistake, a ghost. It feels at least like in the same part of the family tree to me as The Peripheral.
I'm sure it is. I know I first read that story when I was about 14 years old, and it and the rest of the collection it was in was like a major psychedelic experience. It was genuinely mind expanding. It's very weird. I wasn't unusual in that I was a 14-year-old reading Borges in the early 60s, though. Like Borges enjoyed this brief, broad popularity in translation.
That's surprising, actually.
Yeah, it was, and the nearest thing to him was another Argentine writer named Julio Cortázar, who
wrote Hopscotch.
Yeah, wrote Hopscotch. He also wrote a short story called Continuity of Parks that I think of as having some strange connection to the Garden of Forking Paths. But I've had that as, because I read it when I was 14, I've had that as part of my native literary culture. So I don't even have to...
You don't have to cite it.
Yeah, I don't have to think about it.
Well, it also reminded me of once you were talking about your experience as an expatriate. You've lived in Canada for a long time, and there's ways in which America is your native place, but there are ways in which you are no longer a native of America, and the ways that it has gone since you've left.
Yeah. Well, so what? That's kind of a recent awareness for me, or a recent idea for me, is I'd always wondered how, like, does one become Canadian by, lifelong expatriation? I thought, how could that be? It just seemed, I looked inside myself and I couldn't see myself becoming Canadian. And then, in the past couple of years, I've realized that what happens is that the United States, of which I remain very much a native, goes away, but that happens constantly, and throughout human history, that the country in which we were truly born ceases to exist. We outlive it.
And because we're not there witnessing its changes, we're holding on to the memory of the way it was in a different way than someone living in the country.
That's true, but I think I think it doesn't. You don't have to be an expatriate to experience that. I think you only have to live long enough for the majority of the world in which you were born to have changed, to have that experience.
And you also have said that you wanted a double future in the Peripheral to create provide a sort of parallax.
Yeah.
Tell our listeners what you mean. What is a parallax, and what is the idea of a double future creating one doing for you?
Well, if you have only one eye, you have no depth perception. And that's because you need two eyes some distance apart to create what physics calls parallax. You need to have light sources coming in from two different angles, and then you have depth perception, which is why we have two eyes, or in cases of spiders and whatnot, even more. It's why there are very, very few evolved cyclopean animals.
And are you trying to provide essentially a sense of depth and dimension for us to look at potential future?
Well, I wanted to see what would happen. What would happen when one, I hope, reasonably well realized imaginary future looks at another, I hope, reasonably well realized imaginary future. When they look at each other and when they can see each other, how they look to each other. It wasn't something that I could recall having experienced as a reader, and I myself didn't know what it would be like. So a certain long stretch of the composition of the book was erecting a framework that would allow that to happen in considerable detail. I suppose if I were a more methodical writer, or a completely different kind of human being, I might have tried to write a short story as a sort of architectural model. But I don't think prose works that way. I think prose is sort of more fractal in its nature, and I think that the only way you can find out how that works in a novel is to go ahead and write the novel.
So for a final question today, William, back in the 90s, you were on a BBC show called Desert Island Discs, and you talked about your biography, but also intermittently talk about various influential songs. And at the end of the show, they wanted to know what your Desert Island book was. They said you would get the complete works of Shakespeare, and you'd get the Bible, and you'd get to choose one more. And your answer at the time was, instead of washing up on the island, imagine that you were flying over the island in a plane, and you had 3 books in the plane, And on any given day, depending on your mood, you would grab one book as you jumped out. And those three books at the time were the complete collection of Sherlock Holmes, Ulysses, and the complete works of Borges. So I was curious if you felt, if you recognize that today, or if you would change the books in your plane.
As I grow older, I'm actually less fond of Ulysses, I think, but I suppose that could reverse itself. I think that at that time I was hoping to seem more high tone, but the complete Sherlock Holmes and the complete fictions of Borges would still be like those would last you.
That would be a dilemma then. Which one of those?
Yeah, that would be a dilemma.
Huh. Well, it was great having you on Between the Covers today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
We were talking today to the author William Gibson about his latest book, The Peripheral. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host.